Hi everyone, my name is Mark, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. Jonathan was born in Michigan in 1994 to Jennifer and Michael. 3 years later, his sister Jessica came into his life. From a very young age, Jonathan and Jessica formed a bond that's unbreakable. They shared a special connection. Unfortunately, Jonathan's parents, Jennifer and Michael, faced struggles. Their frequent fights meant Jonathan and Jessica were often left in the care of their grandmother, Sandra. Sandra was Jennifer's mother and took on the role of a nurturing caregiver to her grandchildren. She provided Jonathan and Jessica with a safe and loving home away from home. At their grandmother's house, Jonathan and Jessica found solace and comfort. Sandra brought joy and laughter, and the children cherished the moments they spent with her. She was married to Fred Lane. Together, Sandra and Fred created a family unit that nurtured and protected Jonathan and Jessica. In 2008, after enduring years of turmoil, Jennifer and Michael divorced. When Jonathan was a Farmington Central High School senior, he faced a challenging and unexpected turn of events. His mother made the decision to move the family from Michigan to Arizona. The move was difficult for him, as he was leaving behind the only life he had ever known. The situation only worsened for Jonathan and his family when they arrived in Arizona. Shortly after their relocation, his young sister Jessica became gravely ill. After undergoing extensive tests and examinations, doctors discovered a tumor on Jessica's brain. Jessica's diagnosis was devastating for the entire family. Jessica underwent surgery the very next day to remove the tumor. The operation was successful, but it came at a cost. She endured a lengthy recovery, requiring her to stay in the hospital for a whole month. During this time, Jennifer devoted all her time and attention to her daughter's well-being, sacrificing her own needs, which left Jonathan feeling isolated and alone. He had to cope with the pressure of being a teenager in a new state while facing the absence of his mother and sister. Recognizing the strain that Jonathan was going through, Sandra, his grandmother, reached out to Jennifer. Deeply concerned about her grandson's well-being, Sandra suggested sending him north to Michigan to live with her and her husband, Fred. She believed that being around familiar surroundings and old friends would provide Jonathan with some solace during this difficult time. Jonathan was a good kid, but he still possessed the youthful energy and unpredictability that comes with being a teenaged boy. Jennifer worried whether her 74-year-old mother, Sandra, would be capable of caring for him. However, Sandra reassured Jennifer that she was more than capable of taking care of him. 1 month after the Hoffman family moved to Arizona, Jonathan returned to Michigan and moved in with his grandmother Sandra and her husband Fred. This homecoming brought joy and relief to Jonathan, who was midway through his senior year at high school. He was thrilled to be back among his friends and family, feeling a sense of comfort and belonging he had missed while away. Jonathan's friends agreed that he was shy at first, but when he opened up, he was a lot of fun and loved to make people laugh. He had a zest for adventure and was always up for trying new things. When he returned to Michigan and Farmington Central High School, his friends were thrilled to have him back. Jennifer, his mother, missed her son greatly and made the trip to Michigan to visit him for 2 weeks. Despite Jonathan's apparent happiness living with his grandmother, Jennifer discovered that he had been smoking cannabis. However, Jonathan's dabbling in illegal substances did not extend to harder drugs. Although Jennifer was not happy about his cannabis use, she considered this typical teenage experimentation. It was difficult for Jennifer to return home after her trip with her son. With a heavy heart, Jennifer bid farewell to Jonathan, feeling confident that he would be in good hands. As Jennifer made her way back to Arizona, her mind filled with thoughts of her son's well-being. She reassured herself that her mother would never allow any harm to Jonathan, her grandchild. However, Jennifer could not have been more wrong. Little did Jennifer know that Jonathan was in grave danger, and it was at the hands of his grandmother Sandra. In a matter of weeks, Jonathan would be dead. On May 19, 2017, at 5:27 p.m., Jonathan Hoffman made the panicked call to 911, his voice trembling as he relayed to the dispatcher that his grandmother had shot him and he was dying. The dispatcher quickly sprang into action, dispatching police and paramedics to Jonathan's residence. As she spoke to him, she tried to reassure him that help was on the way, her voice steady amongst the chaos and fear in his voice. There was an ominous silence on the line, and for a moment, the dispatcher feared that the connection had been dropped or that Jonathan had passed away. But then, just as her heart sank, she heard a barrage of gunfire erupt from the phone, followed by a pained cry. Jonathan shouted, "Ow!" as his voice cracked with terror as he told the operator that his grandmother had shot him again. The West Bloomfield Township Police Department officers were swiftly dispatched to the scene, arriving at Sandra Lane's house at 5:33 p.m. As they approached, they could hear gunfire coming from within the residence. The officers, trained to handle such situations, didn't hesitate to take the necessary precautions. They positioned themselves behind their patrol vehicles, providing cover for themselves. From their position, the officers observed a woman walking inside the house. They issued clear commands ordering the person inside to place their weapon on the ground. Time seemed to stand still, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Finally, after a tense moment, the officers heard the sound of a gun being secured. With the assurance that the person inside had secured the firearm, they decided to enter the residence. When the police made it inside the home, they found 74-year-old Sandra Lane standing in front of them, a Glock 17 .40 caliber handgun at her feet. Staring at the police, Sandra said, "I murdered my grandson," several times. Sandra was not crying. She was calm and stated the disturbing sentiment as a matter of fact. One of the police officers asked Sandra why she killed her grandson, but Sandra remained silent. 2 minutes after the police arrived at her home, Sandra was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol vehicle. Officers entered her home to find the victim, who Sandra said was her grandson, 17-year-old Jonathan Hoffman. Inside Sandra Lynn's home, the air was heavy with smoke, making it difficult to see through the haze. As they climbed the staircase, they reached the landing where Jonathan lay motionless, face down on the hardwood floor. Dressed in gym shorts and socks, the young man's body was riddled with gunshot wounds to his upper torso. Despite the severity of his condition, the medics managed to detect a faint pulse. With urgency, Jonathan was rushed to Botsford Hospital, where a team of medical professionals worked tirelessly to stabilize his condition. However, their efforts proved futile, and after 30 minutes of intense medical intervention, he was pronounced dead. After the ambulance rushed Jonathan Hoffman to the hospital, Sandra Lane's home was secured as a crime scene. The residence spanned 3 levels, and nearly every room was filled with signs of violence and blood. Crime scene investigators arrived and carefully examined the area, searching for clues that could shed light on the shocking events. As investigators descended the basement staircase, they were immediately struck by the presence of footprints and the bloodstains on the ground. The investigators carefully preserved this evidence. Moving further into the house, the team came across 10 bullet casings scattered in various areas. Each casing was collected. One of the investigators noticed a bullet hole in the drywall. In the search for more evidence, the investigators made their way to the second floor. There they discovered a gun case filled with ammunition. While the investigators were busy collecting evidence, they took special care to photograph Sandra, her face, arms, and hands. While sitting in the back of the patrol car, Sandra became very upset and started to cry. In the middle of the chaos, Fred Lane, Sandra's husband, showed up outside of the house with their dog. According to Fred, he had been gone for an hour, having taken the dog for a walk after Sandra asked him to. Fred was stunned to learn that his wife had admitted to shooting and killing their grandson Jonathan. Once Jonathan was pronounced dead at the hospital, the police faced the challenging task of informing his family that their beloved son was murdered by his grandmother, Sandra Lane. As detectives delved deeper into the case, they learned that Jonathan had been living in Michigan while his parents and sister were residing in Arizona. When the detectives broke the devastating news to Jennifer, informing her that her mother had shot and killed her beloved son, she was left in a state of stunned disbelief. It seemed inconceivable that someone who was supposed to love and cherish their grandchildren could commit such a heinous crime. Everyone knew that Jonathan was his grandmother's favorite, which made it even more unfathomable how he ended up dead at Sandra's hands. As the day wore on, around 7:30 p.m., the police decided to take Sandra Lane to the hospital for a health evaluation, given her advanced age. As they waited in the emergency room, Sandra insisted that Jonathan had never hurt her. She described him as a good boy who never harmed anyone. After a medical assessment, the doctors cleared Sandra of any suspicious injuries. With this, the police decided to place her back into the patrol car and take her to the police department for questioning. On May 20th after midnight, Sandra's attorney met her at the police station. Before she provided her official statement to the police, Sandra sought legal advice from her attorney. When the detectives eventually met with Sandra and her attorney, Sandra's story dramatically changed. At the hospital, she had initially told police that her grandson was not involved in the incident. However, during their meeting at the police station, she claimed that Jonathan and she were engaged in an altercation which involved yelling and screaming. During this altercation, Jonathan kicked her in the stomach, causing her to fear for her life. According to Sandra, Jonathan had been exhibiting strange behavior and signs of anger lately. Jonathan had been coming and going from her house at all hours of the night, and he often brought people over whom she did not particularly care for. Furthermore, Sandra had noticed valuables missing from her home, leading her to suspect that Jonathan or his friends may have been involved in theft. Sandra also mentioned that her grandson has a history of getting into trouble with the law. Sandra claimed while Jonathan was driving, an officer pulled him over and it was discovered that there was cannabis in his car. However, that did not deter him from engaging in similar behavior. Just a short time later, Jonathan was again stopped by an officer, and this time, it was discovered that he was in possession of Adderall. In addition to the aforementioned incidents, Sandra also recounted a time when she had to call 911 due to Jonathan's aggressive behavior. During that particular incident, Jonathan was yelling obscene things at her. However, when the police arrived, Sandra implored them not to arrest Jonathan. According to Sandra, she only purchased a gun because of Jonathan's behavior. Sandra claimed that everything came to head on May 18th, after she took Jonathan to the probation department because he had not been in compliance with his probation. When they returned home, Sandra said Jonathan threatened to take her car, and that is when he attacked her. Since there were no witnesses to Jonathan's shooting other than Sandra, the detectives faced a challenge in confirming her story. Sandra claimed self-defense, making the detectives conduct an investigation into what happened. They needed to ensure they were not sending a 74-year-old frail grandma to prison for defending herself against a violent teenaged boy. The detectives reviewed the picture taken by the crime scene investigators immediately after Sandra admitted to shooting Jonathan. However, the detectives did not find any signs of violence on Sandra. Not a single scratch was present, which would be expected if she'd been in a struggle. During her court arraignment, the judge ruled that Sandra should be held with bond as she awaited trial at the Huron Correctional Facility. Paul Walton, the prosecutor assigned to the case, felt that the 911 call made by Jonathan contradicted Sandra's claim of self-defense. When Paul listened to the call, he noticed a significant period, approximately 2 minutes and 51 seconds, of silence before Sandra fired another shot at Jonathan. Based on Walton's observations, it seemed that Jonathan was already severely injured and posed no immediate threat to Sandra. However, Sandra's defense attorney presented a different argument. They contended that Jonathan was still a threat despite his injuries. The defense highlighted a portion of the 911 call where Sandra is heard yelling, "Let go," during the altercation, suggesting that Jonathan was still coming for his grandmother, even though he was injured. The defense attorneys for Sandra Lane argued that she was nothing more than an innocent and loving grandmother. They argued that the end of the 911 call, where Sandra can be heard saying to her grandson, who was bleeding out, to lie down and that she was going to get him some water, proved that point. According to the defense, these statements showed Sandra's true nature as a compassionate and caring woman. Prosecutor Walton was confused by Sandra Lane. Was she a loving grandmother who had no alternative but to take the life of her grandson in a tragic circumstance? Or was she a cold-blooded murderer who pursued her grandson, ultimately shooting him like an animal in the woods? To gain a deeper understanding of Sandra Lane, Prosecutor Walton initiated a series of interviews around town. These testimonies, all of who were interviewed, painted a consistent picture of Sandra as an ordinary grandmother. Sandra frequented the local salon weekly, actively participated in her synagogue, taught Sunday school, and volunteered her time. She was also known for her generosity and affluence. What struck the detectives most was the overwhelmingly positive feedback from those who knew Sandra. They described her as deeply bonded to her grandchildren, especially Jonathan. The testimonies seemed to contradict the horrific act she had admitted to committing. However, a different story emerged when the detectives interviewed Jennifer, Sandra's daughter, and Jonathan's mother. Jennifer provided a different take on her mother's character, contradicting the image presented by the community. Jennifer claimed that her mother was not the warm and compassionate person portrayed by others. Instead, she painted a different picture, describing her mother as a controlling and abusive person. According to Jennifer, when she grew up, her parents constantly fought, and there were times when Sandra physically assaulted her. Jennifer stated that her father was often absent, leaving her mother complete control over the household. As a result, Sandra acted like a tyrant going on tirades. Eventually, Sandra said her father went on one trip and never returned. Several years after her father's disappearance, Sandra remarried a man named Fred Lane. Jennifer noticed a significant change in her mother's behavior. Sandra expressed a deep love for Fred and believed that he was a good man who brought stability to their home. Initially, Sandra's arguing and controlling behavior seemed to subside. However, Jennifer claimed that after she gave birth to her first child, Jonathan, Sandra once again tried to impose her control. According to Jennifer, her mother, Sandra, became obsessed with her baby to such an extent that Jennifer often joked that she thought Sandra wanted to kidnap the baby and take him away from her. Jennifer believed that Sandra's obsession bordered on an unhealthy level. After Sandra was charged with murdering her grandson Jonathan, the community of West Bloomfield rallied around her. There were a significant number of residents who believed that Jonathan was a drug user who deserved to be killed. In response to this sentiment, members of the community began posting supportive messages on social media, expressing their encouragement for Sandra, referring to her as Granny and using the hashtag #GoGrannyGo. To the public, Jonathan was portrayed as a monster, while Sandra was depicted as an innocent and frail older woman. Jennifer shared that most of her family had accepted Sandra's self-defense narrative and had turned their backs on the memory of both Jonathan and herself. Sandra's husband, Fred, stood by his wife's side throughout the ordeal, offering unwavering support. The medical examiner determined Jonathan Hoffman's manner of death to be homicide. Jonathan's cause of death was the multiple gunshot wounds he sustained. Examination of the wounds revealed the presence of stippling, which indicated that the gun was fired at Jonathan from varying distances. In addition to the gunshot wounds, a toxicology report was conducted on Jonathan's body. The report revealed the presence of synthetic marijuana, also known as spice. At the time, spice, specifically K2, was prevalent among teens and young adults in West Bloomfield. This substance could be purchased at gas stations without identification, and there were several reports of individuals taking it and experiencing adverse reactions, such as violent behavior. Interestingly, 1 month before Jonathan's death, there was a murder involving another student from the same high school. Michael Cipriano, a student like Jonathan, murdered his father Robert following a verbal confrontation. It was reported that Michael was under the influence of spice at the time of the attack. Jessica, Jonathan's sister, had a deep love for her brother, but she was aware of his emotional and sometimes violent tendencies. Despite not wanting to think about it, she began to wonder if her brother had hurt their grandmother, which is why she shot and killed him. 2 months after Sandra was arrested at a circuit court arraignment, she was indicted on 2 more charges: possession of a firearm and the commission of a felony, and a unique indictment called open murder. Open murder is only in effect in select states, including Nevada and Michigan. It encompasses both first and second-degree murder charges. Prosecutor Paul Walton was concerned about the jury's potential reluctance to convict a grandmother of premeditated murder. As a result, he decided to present the jury with a broader range of options, a decision that displeased the defense. They felt that the prosecution was copping out on their job. In 2013, Sandra Lane went on trial for the murder of her grandson. News of the killing spread, garnering national attention. Many people blamed Jennifer, Jonathan's mother, for allegedly sending him with Sandra to Michigan. There were those who posted on social media criticizing Jennifer and suggesting her son deserved to die, along with Jennifer herself. During the trial, Sandra Lane's defense attorneys focused on portraying her as an innocent and loving grandmother. However, the state put forth a contradicting argument, attempting to disprove her claims of self-defense. Prosecutor Walton presented the jury with the images taken after the shooting, which depicted Sandra. He argued that these images indicated inconsistencies in her account of the altercation. One of the notable discrepancies pointed out by Prosecutor Walton was that Sandra's clothes were not ripped, her jewelry was not torn off, and her glasses were still fixed in place. Additionally, her hair remained styled. This evidence implied that there was no physical struggle between Sandra and Jonathan, as she had claimed. Additionally, there was evidence to support the theory that Sandra went down to the basement after the shooting to find additional ammunition. This evidence was shown in the bloody footprints the investigators found on the basement stairs. The crime lab determined the footprints belonged to Sandra, and the blood they were made in was Jonathan. After the prosecution rested their case, Sandra's defense had the opportunity to present their case. In order to strengthen their case, Sandra's attorney decided to allow her to testify on her behalf. Despite the risk involved, the attorney believed that it was important for the jury to hear directly from Sandra herself about the experiences she faced while living with her grandson Jonathan in the months before he was killed. According to Sandra, Jonathan was violent and had a habit of kicking in doors and breaking objects. One time, he even shattered a computer monitor. On the day of the incident that led to Jonathan's death, Sandra claimed that he hit her in the head, which left her feeling threatened and afraid. As a result, she decided to retrieve her gun, hoping it would serve as a means to protect herself. Her intention, according to her testimony, was not to kill her grandson, but rather to stop him from getting back up and attacking her again. However, during cross-examination by Prosecutor Paul Walton, Sandra's defense began to crumble. When pressed by Walton, Sandra admitted that her motive for obtaining the gun was not fear for her safety, but rather wanting Jonathan to listen to her. This admission weakened her credibility as a witness and made it more difficult to argue self-defense. Experts testified that the K2 spice detected in Jonathan's urine at the time of his death indicated he was not actively under the influence of the drug during the time of his death. The location in the urine suggested that the drug had gone through his system, dismissing Sandra's claim that Jonathan was high on the drug and violent. Following the presentation of the evidence presented at the trial, the jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a guilty verdict for second-degree murder and use of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Sandra was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. Kill or be killed, Grandma's gun.